When we go to the university survey, the Science and Innovation Directorate invited the universities to participate, and we had 19 university sections reply. And by university section, this was an identifiable group that had a capability in a certain area. So it might be a research institute, it might be a section within a school or department, or it might be a centre of some sort. That bit hasn't come through and I apologise for that, but a typical university section was around that many researchers, postgraduates, etc. And the funding ranged from 0 to over $2 million for a centre or a section, and that was funding specifically around advanced manufacturing. And I have to say there was some variability in that. So some universities had smaller groups of people working, and others had much larger groups, but that gives us an idea about what we're talking about typically. Overwhelmingly, universities were satisfied with the engagement. So there was only one section that said they weren't satisfied, and we don't have any further details on why. And I think the reasons that researchers found it satisfying were also very interesting. And this is in order of the number of responses. So you can see at the bottom, yes, engaging industry does facilitate extra funding. I would have expected that to be top of the list, but it's not. Top of the list was that it's stimulating. So people wrote back saying, I find it really interesting, it's interesting work, I enjoy working on the problems, I find it stimulating. The next thing that came back was, I like it because I seem to be offering value. So by engaging with industry, I'm able to offer value for both parties. And there was also the way that involving students gave a sense of career path or some sort of opportunities for students as well. So those were the reasons that we found that researchers were satisfied, and again you might hear more experiences of that in the talks after mine. Again, engagement's primarily through direct contact with the researcher, so the industry contacts the researcher directly, and this agrees with what we've seen in the industry survey, so that matches up nicely. And what we did find in the data that was given to us, most of the companies tended to be reflected in one university response. By that I mean companies weren't showing up across all three universities. They tended to have a relationship with one university. And that's something that I think requires some more thinking about. When we look at the manufacturing research capabilities that universities had, you can see that it's very much concentrated around new materials and computer modelling and design. And the types of needs that we saw in the companies that weren't engaging, which were around automation control and precision manufacturing, are much lower in terms of what universities feel that they can provide. We also asked researchers where they thought the opportunities for advanced manufacturing in South Australia were, and this was the list again in a rough order of priority. So there's a mixture of things that relate well to, I guess, expectations of the state about industry, and some new opportunities, I suppose, around clean technologies, healthcare, those sorts of areas as well. And we also asked researchers what they needed for future opportunities. And again, it's not surprising that research funding would be top of that list. But I think what's also interesting is that there is that sense of having hubs and incubators to make things happen. It's about human resources, which, as one researcher said, it's having the right people in the state at the right time with the right mix of skills to make things happen. And it's also about having a longer-term strategy that links together industry and research for a common direction for advanced manufacturing. Now, if we start to look at the comparison of university and industry surveys, there's two things that come out particularly around our key questions. So that one key question was around capability, the other key question was around engagement. And when we look at engagement, what we found, and so the columns are just, there is a set of industry that's not currently engaged, but they've said what they would like for the future. There is a set of industry that is currently engaged, and they've also said what they would like for the future. We asked the researchers the same thing. So for the industry that's not currently engaged, then direct contact with a researcher is really useful. The other things that might be useful for them would be using technical equipment or placing student interns, having that kind of relationship. And for the companies and the researchers that are currently engaged with each other, direct contact with the researcher and joint research activities are seen as really important. So you can already see that there are two types of engagement that might occur depending on what company needs are. And I think the useful part of this data is that direct contact and joint research projects seem to work. We know people are satisfied with the engagement. We know that these are their preferences, and we know that these are their preferences for the future. A lot of this is in the brochure that you were given at the front door as well, so if you're having trouble reading it or you want to sort of refer back to it, you'll find it in that handout. The other thing that was interesting was when we looked at the capabilities, we found 3 areas. And firstly, we found an area when we tried to match these things up on the individual capability levels. There seemed to be an area where research had capability, industry needed capability, and the amount of capability around seemed to be a match, and that was around really computer modelling and design type work. Then there's an area where there is a lot of research happening in universities, and it seems to be in excess of what would be required by the local industry. And you can see that these areas are really around human interfaces, so either medical devices or ergonomics, or they're around new materials. So there is a lot of research being conducted within universities around these areas, probably more research than is required for our local industry, but it does raise interesting opportunities. And then there is another section where the researchers, as you saw in that graph, were not doing a lot of work in automation and control or in some of the manufacturing systems areas. And if we categorise those into those 7 main groups, this is the picture we see. So in computer modelling and design, if you're looking for help with that, you're likely to get it from an industry point of view. There seems to be room for joint research projects. In new materials and human interfaces, there is more work than is required by local industry. And interestingly enough, from my conversations with universities, we expect that this is because these are the areas that are being funded federally. And they're being funded because we can do cutting-edge international quality research in these areas, and that's what's being funded. And that provides us with opportunities for new industry, but it's also perhaps not the sort of research that works well with existing industry. And then there is this area around automation control, precision manufacturing, manufacturing systems, where there is little research being done at the cutting edge. And maybe this is because it's not cutting edge research that is required in these areas. Perhaps it's actually translation of older research, perhaps it's actually business improvement work that needs to be done, perhaps it's a different kind of engagement rather than a joint research project that needs to be done at this area. So if I come back to my engagement graph and we looked at those 4 areas and the type of engagement, what we've really tried to do is work out across that spectrum what would be required for engagement and what sort of capabilities are required in that engagement. And my summary is something that looks like this. I think there are a group of manufacturing operations that probably wouldn't benefit greatly from university engagement. These may be industry groups or industry operations that aren't able to transform and perhaps should exit the industry. And there may be some that provide a useful service and still wouldn't be benefited greatly from industry research collaboration. Then there are a group of organisations that perhaps in translating some of that older research or helping with business processes or helping on particular problems driven by industry to find the right research or find the right government solution, their operations can transform into more sophisticated manufacturing operations. And as I've indicated in that diagram, I think that has to be industry driven. And I think that there's a role there to help industry facilitate direct contact with researchers around particular problems. And I was talking to a colleague the other day who said, look, we can, from university, who said we can help people on particular problems, but again, it comes to the language issue. It's about talking to people on the floor about their specific problems and perhaps finding a very short-term project that helps them solve that problem. So it's not really a joint research program, it's really about applied problem solving and working together in that framework. And I think that's probably a gap. Then in the advanced manufacturing operations, and I think you will hear from this in the speakers following, there are companies which have identified, strategically identified an area that they can grow into that requires a set of research to help them get to that place. And that can be very successfully done in a joint project with a university. And then finally, there is that university research that's being done perhaps in those new material areas or in the medical device areas or in some of those other areas with a bit of help could transform and spin out into new operations. So a lot of that work is done on a project by project base. There starts to be a a capability that's built up. With a little bit of more support, that capability could grow into new industry for South Australia. So that's really the spectrum of what we found.